You know how easy it is to begin a piece, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, poetry or a play, knowing where it's going to go and what you're going to find along the way. You have a plan, you start out, it all seems good. And then as you write following that plan, the piece just never seems to sing. It doesn't leap off the page. It never grabs your throat and growls. In fact, after a while, you kind of lose interest in writing it, and you have to ask yourself why your readers would want to read it if you're not interested in writing it. That's that point where we've clutched, where we've said, I'm in control here, I'm not letting you go. An editor reviewing an earlier version of the memoir that Paige was talking about, Walking Nature Home, said it was a good story. She wrote to me and she said, it's a good story, but it's not great. Her advice, she said, was to let it off the leash. Now, mind you, she wrote this to me when I had a Great Dane who outweighed me by 30 pounds. So that was a very vivid suggestion to me. It was a very vivid metaphor, let it off the leash. I could just imagine Isis and me flying down the street, her at a full gallop, and me tailing her in the air, and me just letting go of the leash. And of course, what would happen? Splat. So it was a vivid metaphor, and one that I had to think about a little bit. And in particular, she said, let the love story grow. So my response to that was to feel like that would be kind of awfully public, wouldn't it? And it reminded me of Terry's comment about writing often feeling like undressing in public. And then I said, oh yeah, oh wait, this is a memoir. Oh yeah, public, okay, right, oh, yeah, right. So I said to myself, all right, we're gonna let this story off the leash, and began the millionth revision that I did to that memoir. And as soon as I quit saying, oh, we don't wanna go there, the story just took off like my Great Dane at full gallop and went places that terrified me, but really worked very well, actually, and it began to take on its own wonderful life. So we have the biologist learning to write, and then we have the biologist opening herself up to love. No fashion comments, that was a long time ago. So another little tiny bit from this book, Walking Nature Home. And I will remind you that you can take the scientist out of science, but you cannot take the scientist out of her writing. This is about love. My late wonderful husband and I fell in love at first sight. We had dinner together at a friend's birthday party. My housemates allowed him to come for dinner at our house to vet him. And when they approved, we were allowed to go on a date. We went on a date, moved in together, and we're together 29 years. We were both divorced, I should point out, having done a very bad job at our first marriages. No one would have bet on us as good bets for being together that long, especially after one date. So in Walking Nature Home, I thought I had to address that. Why did this crazy woman go on a date with this guy who actually wasn't divorced from his first wife and the mother of his child because they hadn't agreed on child custody in the 3 years they'd been separated? But that was a technicality in my mind. Why did this woman, who was actually, I guess I was actually director of the Women's Center at the University of Wyoming then, wasn't I, Virginia Sharp? Why did this pioneering feminist woman move in with this guy after one date? So I thought I ought to write about that in the memoir. Falling in love at first sight may in fact be a biological reality, an instant recognition impelled by our genes and expressed in the subtle language of the aromatic compounds that define our chemical individuality. Research shows that women choose mates in part by, and I love this, smell. Not the fragrance of cologne, aftershave, or shampoo, but the essential odor of a man's body. That odor gives clues to the makeup of his immune system, especially one critical set of genes called the major histocompatibility complex. Bear with me here. This gene region contains the instructions for manufacturing a diverse range of protein molecules called the human leukocyte antigen proteins. And these are important little critters, so hang on. Their function is to grab antigens, which include any suspicious particles or molecules like viruses and bacteria, from inside your cells and take them outside for inspection and disposal by passing immune system molecules. Different human leukocyte antigen protein molecules lock into different antigens or viruses and bacteria. Thus, the more diverse the genes in a person's major histocompatibility complex, the more kinds of those human leukocyte antigen protein tools in their molecular toolkit, the greater their chances of disposing of those harmful viruses and bacteria and staying healthy. All good. In order to give her offspring the best shot at survival and thus of passing on her genes, a woman needs a mate whose major histocompatibility complex contains instructions for the tools that her own lacks. Okay, this makes sense. So how does a woman pry into the genetic contents of her potential mate's major histocompatibility complex? Can you see this on a date? Excuse me, but can I talk to your geneticist? Do you have a report on your major histocompatibility complex? Because I'd like to see it. It's not that hard. Smell. The proteins synthesized by the genes in this complex affect our body odor. Research shows that women invariably prefer the scent of men whose immune complexes are complementary to their own. So we sniff our way to love. And that explains the fragrance industry, right? Right there. Millions of dollars. And when we find the right smell, our bodies know it in a way that words cannot express. How much of the delight that Richard and I knew as new lovers was that wordless communication passed between us as we lay together, pressed skin to skin, breathing in the sweaty scents of each other's bodies. Richard and I fit as if our bodies recognized each other at the molecular level. If the subtle sense of his immune complex complemented mine, however, promising those human leukocyte antigen proteins I lacked, I couldn't assimilate that sensory data. My intuition cried, "Go ahead," while my intellect countered, "Hold back." I did hold back. I didn't tell Richard about my illness. I have lupus. It's an autoimmune disease that's often fatal, and I've had it my entire adult life. When I met him, I wasn't supposed to live long. That lie by omission weighed increasingly heavily on me until one windy March afternoon when I asked him if he had time for a talk. We walked downtown hand in hand, leaning into the waves of air that poured through the streets of Laramie. We stopped at a gourmet candy store and splurged on 2 chocolate truffles, smooth and fat and decadent. Then we headed for the steamy warmth of a cafe, found a table by the window, and ordered coffee. As we fed each other bites of chocolate so rich they exploded on my tongue, I told him the story of my diagnosis, symptoms, research, and prognosis. It's not clear how long I'll live. Might be 2 years, might be 10. My voice trailed off, and I looked down at my napkin, pleated between nervous fingers. His hand slipped over my cold ones, his long fingers warm and strong. "Suze," he said, his voice rough. I looked up. Tears leaked out of the corners of his eyes, sliding down his cheeks in wet ribbons into his beard. My own eyes watered. Of course, I cry at dog food commercials, so that's nothing big. It doesn't matter how long you live. I don't care if you're sick or what's ahead. I love you. Nothing can change that. I gripped his hands tightly. "Thank you," I whispered, and suddenly I knew. I love you, too. That really did feel like undressing in public when I read it. I've gotten much better since then. Courage, which to me is really the biggie. Courage, in a lot of ways, is the biggie, because it's what gives us the gumption to get up and face our work when we do. Each time we sit down to write takes courage. Maybe just a little, maybe a lot. Particularly when the work isn't working, or when we've gotten kind of in over our heads, or when we're being honest and open and we realize that, oh dear, we're really not actually in control. And that may be a good thing, but it's pretty scary. The noun means the ability to do something that frightens one. Strength in the face of pain or grief, says my dictionary. And the part I love is the etymology that always grabs me. From the old French courage, a beautiful word, which itself is from the Latin cor, heart. Courage ultimately comes from the heart. What does that mean for writing from the heart? A phrase I love to bring to it is stolen from Mary Chapin Carpenter, the singer-songwriter, from her song Goodnight America. Writing with your heart outstretched as if it were your hand. There it is, out there, your heart, as if it were your hand. And we know what the world does when we put things out. Sometimes it's good to them, sometimes it comes along with knives and scissors. That's courage. So is speaking truth to power, tackling difficult subjects. Courage. It takes courage to be us in our work. It takes courage to talk about the things that aren't comfortable, that we prefer not to talk about. It takes courage to evolve into the best writers we can. And so here is our scientist who evolved into a writer, opened herself to love, and then to loss. That is one of my favorite pictures of my late husband and I on the last trip we took together less than a year ago. And this is a piece from my new memoir, which is called Bless the Birds, or at least I call it Bless the Birds, and there's a story there that I don't have time to tell you tonight. This piece is called Every End is a Beginning. And it starts with an epigram. I always get those confused. You can tell me later. From Ralph Waldo Emerson. Our lives are an apprenticeship to the truth, that around every circle another can be drawn, that there is no end in nature, but every end is a beginning. Emerson's quote was circling my mind when I woke at 10 past midnight on the Saturday after Thanksgiving, aware that Richard, the love of my life and my husband for nearly 29 years, was restless. I reached a hand from under the covers in the bed we had shared for so long, the bed he built for us in the house he designed and built for us, threaded it through the railings of the hospital bed snug next to ours, and felt his forehead. It was a bit sweaty, and his right hand was twitching rhythmically. "Did you lose your rock?" I asked. I felt around for the wave-flattened basalt beach pebble a friend had sent from Washington State. He had been holding it since he quit speaking during a restless period the day before. It wasn't under his hand, so I pulled back the covers and felt around, found the disc-shaped pebble, and replaced it. He squeezed my fingers and then let go. I felt for his other rock, a glacier-smooth pebble from our own valley, a gift from another friend who explained that she treasured it because it represented the contact where two different kinds of rock came together, like he and I. It was still tucked into a fold of his night tea over his heart. Those rocks were Richard's touchstones, reminders of his work as an abstract sculptor who called rocks ambassadors of the earth, fashioning rough boulders into polished vessels with interiors that allowed you to see inside the rock, rocks that brought a connection with the earth into our daily lives and our daily routines. He carved rocks into sinks and basins and fire pits and all manner of ordinary, magical uses for rocks. The two pebbles in his hospital bed accompanied him as brain cancer turned the cycle of his life away from this world toward whatever is next. We had walked the 2+ year journey with his brain cancer hand in hand, doing our best to live well and love each moment, conscious that his life could end at any time. He was fortunate. He continued his sculpture work and reading and teaching his art, even after he began hospice care at home, until the tumor that had colonized his right brain caused so much damage that he began to lose his strength, then his ability to walk, to sit up, to eat, and finally, very hard for this intellectual man to talk. That Saturday night, he seemed comfortable again. I settled in our bed beside him to snatch more sleep. Then he burped, his whole upper body convulsing as his empty stomach clenched. I felt his right bicep tense into a hard lump. Must be time for more of your meds, I said. I'll go crush the tablets and be back with the syringe. I'd begun crushing his drugs when he began having trouble swallowing the day before. I'd mixed the powdered drugs into a syringe full of water and sucked the resultant slurry into the syringe and squirted into his mouth. His wheezy breathing slowed. He was listening. I'll be right back, I said, squeezing his hand. When I returned with the full syringe, he opened his mouth just far enough for me to remove the small sponge on a lollipop he sucked for moisture, squirt in the drugs, and replace the refreshed sponge. I crawled back under the covers, stuck my hand through the rails, and found his hand. Remember the Emerson quote, I said? The one in the beautiful circular frame you made? I recited the quote, ending with, "There is no end in nature, but every end is a beginning." You're headed for a beginning, I said, tears clogging my throat. I'm going to miss you every day, but my love will be with you, and there's love coming to you from around the world. It'll buoy you through this end that is also a beginning. His hand twitched, his fingers barely squeezing mine. Tomorrow's Sunday, I said. Do you want our meeting friends to gather as usual? His thumb moved in a hint of his familiar thumbs up sign. Okay, I said. I'll let them know to be here around 10:30. I love you so. He burped again, then relaxed. The fast, shallow breathing resumed. The next morning, when our friends arrived for our weekly hour of worship in the manner of Quakers and Buddhists, and no, that's not a contradiction, his breathing was harsher and more labored. We gathered in the bedroom around his hospital bed, talking and laughing. Molly and I on the big bed with our hands on Richard, our friends at the foot of his narrow hospital bed. While the others greeted him and chatted, exchanging the week's news, I felt his forehead and checked for his rocks. They were in place. Then I looked at his skin. It was yellow, not his usual healthy, ruddy Cherokee tone. It seemed sunken. You're closer to that combined ending and beginning, aren't you? I said softly. The lid of one eye slid open. I kissed him and gently closed it. I love you. Before we could settle into worship, Katie, Richard's weekend hospice nurse, arrived to take his vital signs. We watched as she took out her stethoscope to check his pulse, placed it on his chest, and listened intently. I've got 106, she said. I turned around to see if Molly had noted that data in his chart. And when I looked back at Richard, the hair on my neck prickled. His chest was still. You didn't, I said without thinking. You didn't just die when I wasn't looking. The eyelid closest to me pulled upward. He took a gulp of air. The room went still as he breathed, softly now, a dozen more times, and then stopped. We all watched his motionless chest. After a minute, Katie took out her stethoscope again to listen. He's gone. She headed off to make the official calls. We hugged each other, cried, and hugged Richard's now still form. Molly went next door to get her boyfriend, Mark. Then Katie joined us, and we gathered around Richard's hospital bed one last time and sat with him, enfolding him in our weekly worship. That evening, after we washed his body and gently prepared it for donation to the medical school so he could continue teaching, after Katie had finished filling out the paperwork, which I must say is endless, and the mortuary guys came to take Richard to their cooler to be held overnight for his final trip to the big city. After we had gone to brunch and laughed and cried and toasted his life, after the house had settled into stillness, I walked out on the front porch and looked up at the sky. The bright crescent of the new moon was setting over the peaks in the west, and in the afterglow of sunset with Venus sparkling near. That's the moon we share, I said out loud, trusting that Richard's spirit could hear me. Every end is a beginning. Writing with heart is writing with openness. It's writing with honesty. It's writing with courage. They're all related. They're all part of it. But it's what brings our stories, our voices out into the world in a way that they last, that they open minds, they change hearts, maybe they change the world. As Laura Ingalls Wilder, for whom the Laura Awards are named, said, "The real things haven't changed. It is still best to be honest and truthful, to make the most of what we have, to be happy with simple pleasures, and to have courage when things go wrong." So all of you, go on and write with heart. Thank you.